Many experienced professionals carry a quiet form of self-doubt. From the outside, they often appear capable, confident, even successful. They've built careers, developed expertise, navigated complex situations and responsibilities. And yet, inside, something else can be happening. A quiet questioning, a hesitation, a moment before speaking where they think, am I really qualified to say this? What if I get this wrong? What will people think of me? And this just doesn't just happen early in someone's career. In fact, I often see it most strongly in people who are highly experienced, people who care deeply about doing things well, people who hold themselves to high standards, people who want their work to have meaning. Hi, I'm Jenny, and this is my weekly expert talk on procrastination and empowerment. And today's talk is reclaiming your power, moving from self-doubt to self-belief. You might recognize yourself in the description I just provided. It might show up as overthinking before you share an idea, holding back in conversations, rewriting something multiple times before posting it, or even avoiding taking a step forward altogether. Not because you don't care, but because you care so much. And over time, this can become quite exhausting because on the one hand, there's a part of you that feels, I have something to offer. And on the other hand, there's a voice that says, but what if it's not good enough? If you've ever experienced that tension, you're not alone. And more importantly, there is nothing wrong with you. One of the most important things I want to share today is this. Self-doubt is not a sign that you are incapable. Let me say that again. Self-doubt is not a sign that you are incapable. Very often, it's a sign that you are standing at the edge of growth. Because self-doubt tends to appear most strongly in moments where something matters. When you're about to step into something new, when you're about to be seen, when you're about to use your voice in a different way. And so today, what we're really exploring is this. How do we move from that place of hesitation to a place of self-trust? Not by eliminating doubt completely, but by learning how to relate to it differently. So to begin that process, it helps to first understand something important, because self-doubt can feel very personal. It can feel like, this is just me. This is my limitation. But in reality, self-doubt is something that follows very understandable patterns. So let's take a closer look at that now. Let's explore the reality of self-doubt, where it comes from, and why it shows up so strongly at certain moments in our life. So when we experience self-doubt, it can feel very personal. It can feel like there's something wrong with me. Other people don't struggle like this. Maybe I'm just not confident enough. But one of the most important things to understand is this. Self-doubt is not random, and it's not a personal flaw. It actually follows very predictable patterns. Over time, I've noticed that self-doubt tends to show up most strongly in three specific situations. And once you begin to recognize these, something shifts. Instead of feeling stuck inside the doubt, you can begin to observe it with a little more clarity. So the first one is self-doubt appears during change. So anytime you step outside what feels familiar, your mind naturally tries to protect you. If you spent years working within structured environments, organisations, roles, systems, there are clear expectations. You know what's required. You know how to perform, and you know how to succeed. But when you step into something new, especially something like sharing your ideas, starting a business, or putting yourself out there, there are fewer clear rules, and that uncertainty can feel very uncomfortable. So your subconscious responds with questions like, what if I get this wrong? What if this doesn't work? And it's not because you're incapable, but because you're doing something unfamiliar. The second point is self-doubt appears when you are seen. So this is a big one because being visible means being open to opinions, feedback, judgment. Even if that judgment never actually comes, the possibility of it can feel very real. So before sharing something, a post, an idea, an opinion, there's often a pause, a moment of hesitation, a thought like, what will people think? And again, this isn't a weakness. It's a very human response. We are wired to want connection and belonging. So the idea of being judged or rejected can feel very uncomfortable. The third is self-doubt appears when something matters. So this shows up when something is important to you, when you care deeply about what you're doing, and then you're more aware of the potential risks. You want to do it well. You want it to be meaningful. You want it to be received positively, and so the stakes feel higher. This is why self-doubt often appears strongest when you are stepping into meaningful work, using your voice in a new way, or moving towards something that truly matters to you. So when you bring these three things together, change, visibility, and meaning, you begin to see something important. The moments when self-doubt feels strongest are often the exact moments where growth is happening. And that leads to a powerful reframe. Self-doubt is not a signal to stop. Very often, it's a signal that you are stepping into something that matters to you. Now, that doesn't mean it feels easy. Even when we understand this intellectually, in the moment, self-doubt can still feel very real. It can still create hesitation. It can still make it difficult to find the words or take the next step. And this is where the journey becomes more personal, because understanding self-doubt is one thing, but learning how to move through it is something else. So there was a moment in my own journey when this became very real for me. A situation where I felt that hesitation, that uncertainty, that internal questioning. And it was in that moment that I began to understand what it really means to reclaim your voice. And I'd like to share that experience with you now. So there was a moment in my own journey where this became so real for me. At the time, I was participating in a long coaching training program. And during that program, I had an interaction with a person that left me feeling quite unsettled. At the time, I believed this person was gaslighting me. Now, what was interesting about this experience wasn't just what was happening in the conversation, it was what was happening inside me. I remember feeling a sense of confusion. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it initially. And more importantly, I couldn't find the words to respond. Have you ever had a moment like that where you know something isn't quite right, but in the moment you hesitate? You question yourself. You wonder, am I overreacting? Maybe I've understood this. And that's exactly where I found myself. And in those early moments, I didn't speak up clearly. In fact, there was one occasion where I was meeting with this person and another person on a Zoom call. And I found myself frozen and couldn't speak. But I was so uncomfortable, I just left the Zoom meeting without saying anything. And I felt really bad about it. And like a couple of days later, I contacted the people and apologized to them for doing that and explained what had happened. But the gaslighting kept happening on a reasonably regular basis. And I made a few attempts, but they felt uncertain. I was really not sure what to say, but I actually did speak these times. So I was a bit hesitant, not quite grounded in what I really wanted to say. At the same time, the training that I was going through had a strong focus on something quite important: self-value. It was supposedly about managing your money better, but the underlying theme of it was self-value. So I was learning to recognize my own worth, learning to trust my own perspective. And as I continued through the program, something began to shift. I started to realize that my experience of the situation mattered, that how I felt was valid, that I didn't need to have the perfect words in order to speak up. And then the situation happened again. But this time I approached it differently. I stayed calm. I didn't try to over-explain. I didn't try to justify myself. I said something like, "I'm not happy with how you've been speaking to me." And then I did something that even surprised me. I thanked the person. I thanked them for everything I had learned from the time we had spent together as friends and from navigating the situation that was making me uncomfortable. And then I disengaged. And I've not had contact with that person again at all. But when that interaction ended, I noticed something shift inside me. There was relief, enormous relief, because I'd finally said what needed to be said. There was also pride, because I had done it calmly and respectfully without losing myself in the process. And there was also a quiet sense of joy. Not because I had won anything, but because I had honoured my own voice. And that moment has stayed with me because it helped me understand something important. Reclaiming your power isn't about becoming louder. It's not about becoming more forceful. It's not about having perfect confidence. It's about something much simpler and much more powerful. It's about trusting yourself enough to say what feels true for you. Let me say that again so that you can write it down, because it's important. This is about trusting yourself enough to say what feels true for you. And what I began to notice after that was that this wasn't just relevant in that one situation. It showed up in other areas of my life too, in sharing ideas, in stepping into visibility, in beginning to create something of my own. The same pattern appeared. There was a moment of hesitation, followed by a choice. Do I stay quiet or do I trust my voice? And each time I chose to trust myself, even in small ways, something began to build. Not instant confidence, but something deeper: self-trust. And this is where the journey becomes really interesting, because moments like this are not random. The hesitation I felt, the questioning, the initial difficulty in speaking up, these are experiences that many people have, and they don't happen by accident. They are actually deeper patterns that shape how self-doubt shows up in our lives. So to understand how we begin to move from self-doubt to self-belief, it helps to explore something important. Why does self-doubt show up in the first place? What we often discover is that it's not just about the moment we're in. It's shaped by patterns that have developed over time. And understanding these patterns is important because when we don't understand them, self-doubt can feel very personal, very fixed, almost like this is just who I am. But when we begin to understand where it comes from, something starts to shift. Instead of feeling inside the self-doubt, we can begin to step back and observe it with a little more clarity and a little more compassion. And there are three key reasons I often see self-doubt develop. The first one is learned patterns. From a very early age, many of us are taught, often unintentionally, to look outside ourselves for validation. In fact, when we are born and in our younger years, we only really have that choice. That is something we need to get that external validation initially before we can start validating ourselves. But we often miss that lesson because people don't know they need to teach children that. Anyhow, we learn to seek approval, avoid getting things wrong, and we learn to fit into expectations. We're rewarded for being good, capable, reliable. And over time, we begin to associate our sense of worth with how others respond to us. So when we move into situations where there is less external validation, like sharing our own ideas or stepping into something new, it can feel very unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because there isn't always someone there to say, you are doing this right. And so the mind steps in with uncertainty. Let's have a sip. So the second thing is the habit of self-protection. The second reason self-doubt shows up is that the subconscious is trying to protect us. It's one of the subconscious's main roles. And its role is not to help us grow at all. Its role is to help us stay safe. And in many ways, it's very good at that. When you consider doing something that feels uncertain, especially something that involves visibility or judgment, the subconscious naturally scans for risk. And it offers thoughts like, what if this doesn't go well? What if people don't respond positively? What if you regret this? And it's not because it wants to hold you back, but because it wants to avoid discomfort. The challenge is the same system that protects us from discomfort can also prevent us from stepping into growth. And the third thing is the fear of being judged. And this is often the strongest one. As human beings, we are wired for connection. We want to belong. We want to feel accepted. So the idea of being judged, criticized, or misunderstood can feel deeply uncomfortable. Even if nothing negative has actually happened, the possibility of it can be enough to create the hesitation. And this is especially true when you begin sharing your ideas, stepping into visibility, or creating something of your own. Because now you're no longer operating within a defined role. You're expressing something more personal, and that can feel more vulnerable. So when we bring these three things together, learned patterns, self-protection, and fear of judgment, we start to see something important. Self-doubt isn't random, and it's not a reflection of your capability. It's a natural response to stepping into something that is new, visible, and meaningful. And this is where the shift begins. Because once you understand this, you no longer have to treat self-doubt as something that defines you. You can begin to relate to it differently. So instead of asking, how do I get rid of this? You can begin asking, how do I move forward even when this is present? And this is where reclaiming your power really begins. Not by waiting for self-doubt to disappear, but by learning how to stay connected to yourself even when it shows up. Because the goal isn't to become someone who never experiences doubt. The goal is to become someone who can say, even though this is here, I still trust myself. So in the next part, I want to share a simple way of understanding how that shift happens, how we move from self-doubt to something much more stable and empowering, self-belief. So if self-doubt is something that naturally shows up, the question becomes, how do we move through it? Because most people try to deal with self-doubt in one of two ways. They either try to push it away, saying something like, I shouldn't feel like this, I need to be more confident, or they listen to it completely and allow it to stop them. But there's a third way, a much more powerful way. And that is not about eliminating self-doubt. It's about changing your relationship with it. Reclaiming your power begins when you realize you don't need to wait for confidence in order to trust yourself. Because confidence can fluctuate. It comes and goes depending on the situation. But self-trust, that's something deeper. And self-trust is what allows you to take action, even when doubt is present. So I'd like to share a very simple way of understanding this shift. A 3-step process you can begin to use immediately. Step 1 is awareness. The first step is simply to notice when self-doubt appears. Not to judge it, not to push it away, just to recognize it. You can't talk. You might notice thoughts like, what if this isn't good enough? What if people don't respond well? And instead of getting caught up in those thoughts, you gently step back and acknowledge, this is self-doubt. That alone creates a small amount of space for you. The second step is reconnection. And this is to reconnect with your own voice. Because when self-doubt appears, we often disconnect from ourselves. We start looking outward. We start imagining what other people might think. So the shift here is very simple. You bring your attention back inwards. And you ask something like, what do I actually think? What feels true for me? Not what is perfect, not what will be approved, just what feels honest. This is where self-trust begins to rebuild. The third step is expression. And this is to take a small action from that place. Not a big dramatic step, not a leap, just something simple. It might be sharing an idea, saying what you need to say, posting something you've been holding back, or setting a small boundary. And the important part is this, you do not need, you're not doing it because you feel completely confident. You're doing it because you're choosing to trust yourself anyway. And each time you do this, something begins to shift. You start to gather evidence. Evidence that you can handle discomfort. Evidence that your voice is valid. Evidence that you can move forward even when things feel uncertain. And over time, that builds into something much more stable than confidence. Self-belief. Not the kind of belief that says, I'll get everything right, but the kind that says, whatever happens, I trust myself to handle it. And that's where your power really is. not in controlling every outcome, but in knowing that you can stay connected to yourself no matter what. So rather than just talking about this as an idea, I'd like to give you a moment to experience it for yourself, because this shift doesn't happen through thinking alone. It happens through practice. So we're going to do a short reflection exercise together to help you connect with your own voice in a very practical way. And I'm just going to have a drink before I start it. So let's take a few moments now to explore this in a practical way. If you're comfortable, you might like to put your feet flat on the ground just so you feel connected. Take a gentle breath and allow yourself to become a little more present. I'm going to guide you through a short reflection. There's nothing you need to get right here. This is simply an opportunity to reconnect with your own voice. So take another deep breath. And if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes. But feel free to open them up again if you need to take notes. So I'd like you to think of a recent situation where self-doubt showed up. It might have been something you wanted to say, but didn't. An idea you held back. A moment where you hesitated. Just bring that situation gently to mind and keep taking deep breaths in and out. As you think about that moment, notice what was happening inside you. What thoughts were present? You might recall thoughts like, I'm not sure about this. Maybe I should stay quiet. Just observe without judgment. Now gently shift your attention. Instead of focusing on the doubt, ask yourself, what did my inner voice want to say in that moment? And when I talk about your inner voice here, I'm talking about consciously, what did you want to say? Not the perfect words, just the honest ones. Now imagine giving that voice a little more space. If you had trusted yourself fully in that moment, what might you have said or done? It doesn't have to be dramatic. It might be something simple, like expressing an idea, setting a boundary, saying how you felt. Just notice what comes up. Now just take a moment to acknowledge something important. That voice you've just connected with, it's already there. It hasn't disappeared. It doesn't need to be created. This process is simply about learning to hear it, trust it, and gradually act on it. But whenever you're ready, you can bring your attention back and open your eyes. And take a couple of deep breaths. And if you need to, stop the recording and take some notes. So what you've just done is a small example of reclaiming your power. Not by removing self-doubt, but by choosing to reconnect with yourself alongside of the doubt. And this is something you can return to again and again, in small moments, in everyday situations, because each time you do, you strengthen that connection to your own voice. And this is really where the journey begins to open up, because once you start reconnecting with your own voice, you begin to see new possibilities for how you show up, how you express yourself, and even the kind of work you might create in the world. So as we begin to bring things together, I'd like to share a simple next step you can take if you'd like to continue exploring this journey a little more deeply. So as we begin to bring this conversation to a close, I'd like to invite you to take a moment and reflect. What has stood out to you today and what has resonated? So just take a moment to jot those questions down. What has stood out for you today and what has resonated? Because often it's those small moments of recognition, those quiet, yes, that's me moments, that signal something important. For many people, the journey from self-doubt to self-belief doesn't begin with a dramatic decision. It begins with something much simpler, a willingness to explore, a willingness to listen to that quieter voice within you. And if today has resonated with you, if you'd recognize some of these patterns in your own life, then it may be a sign that you're ready for the next step in that exploration. This is exactly the journey I guide people through in my work, through what I call the courageous pathway. It's a step-by-step process that supports experienced professionals to move through self-doubt, reconnect with their voice, and begin creating work that feels meaningful and aligned. Because as we've explored today, this isn't just about confidence. It's about something deeper. It's about learning to trust yourself. So if you'd like to continue exploring this in your own time, I've created a simple starting point. And if you'd like to come along to one of my 3-day challenges, I'm currently doing that one at the moment. I'm on day 3 today. But there'll be another one in about 6 weeks' time. If you'd like to let me know if you want to go on a waiting list for that, then you can just contact me, DM me, and I'll put you on the waiting list. So there's no pressure. It's simply there as a possibility if you feel ready for it. And whether you choose to explore that or not, I want to leave you with this. Self-doubt is something many of us experience, but it doesn't have to define the direction of your life, because your voice is already there. Your experience already has value. And your power begins in the moments where you choose to trust yourself, even just a little more than you did before. Thank you for being here and for being open to this conversation. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And your next step doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be courageous. Thank you for coming along today. And I hope you've got something out of this.